Hi everyone, Claire here. Welcome back to CCC's Curious Kitchen. Today we're making berry chantilly cake based on the Whole Foods version. So think white cake layered with rich mascarpone frosting and lots of berries inside. Let's get started. Alright, so let's start by talking about the ingredients we're going to be using. So in this bowl, I've combined most of my dry ingredients. So flour, baking soda, baking powder, salt. I think that's it. So for this recipe, I based it off of the white cake recipe from Sally's Baking Addiction. We're using cake flour. So cake flour and all-purpose flour are different, and they will give you different results. Cake flour, for one, is ground much more finely than all-purpose flour, which helps give cakes a really fine texture. And it also has less gluten protein than all-purpose flour. So cakes, to be really tender, we want to reduce the amount of gluten formed in them. The structure actually comes more from starch. So the less gluten we have in this cake, the better. Cake flour, at least in the US, is also often chlorinated to give it a whiter bleached color. This chlorination actually changes the cake flour in a couple of ways that helps us make fine textured cakes. So one, the flour is a little more acidic, so it sets earlier in the oven. Two, the chlorination actually helps the starch absorb more water, and that actually allows us to add more sugar into the batter to make a more tender cake. And lastly, the chlorinated starch actually sticks to fat better. And as we're gonna see, our fat or our butter is gonna carry a lot of the air in this cake batter. So if it sticks to the flour better, it also results in a more fine textured cake. So recipes that call for cake flour will work with all-purpose flour in the sense that you're probably still going to get like a cake that bakes and comes out and looks nice and tastes nice, but it's not going to be the same as the one that the recipe intended. So just keep that in mind. So moving on, I have butter and sugar. So as with a lot of cake recipes, we're gonna cream these together, and that's going to provide most of the air in this cake batter. The butter and sugar are also what are called tenderizers. So they also prevent gluten from forming, and that'll make our cake more tender. I also have some sour cream, which also contains fat that will help tenderize the cake and make it really nice and moist. Milk is going to be our main liquid for this cake. That's going to dissolve everything and hydrate all the flour. And finally, we have egg whites. So white cake is white because it doesn't contain any egg yolks, and the egg whites in this recipe are going to contribute moisture and proteins to help set the cake. I'm going to start by mixing the dry ingredients together, because before we add it to any other of the ingredients, we want it to be really evenly dispersed so they'll go in evenly into the cake. So you can use a whisk for it, a fork. I'm going to be using this mixer later anyway, so I'm just going to give it a nice, 30 seconds in there. Now that our dry ingredients are thoroughly combined, I'm going to get started with the butter and the sugar. So this mixing method of butter and sugar together and then dry ingredients and liquid like milk, it's called the creaming method, and it's pretty common for cakes. So a couple things to keep in mind. Like I mentioned earlier, this step is crucial for good aeration in our batter. Sugar comes in crystals, so those rough edges actually carry air into the butter as we cream them together. And then those bubbles are later enlarged by the baking powder and baking soda when we bake it in the oven. In order for the butter to hold as much air as possible, it needs to be at a cool room temperature, about 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So I've left this out to let it come to room temperature. So I'm just gonna start off by beating it a little to lighten it up, and then add the sugar, and we're gonna beat it until they're light and fluffy. All right, That took a good 5 minutes or so, but this is about the texture we want. You can see that the butter and sugar are fully incorporated and it's nice and fluffy. This step is also really important for determining the final crumb of your cake. So if you beat it the right amount, you're gonna get a nice, even, fine crumb. But if you underbeat it, for example, the holes are gonna be more uneven and you won't get as high of a rise. Okay, next I'm going to add the eggs, the sour cream, and the vanilla, which is also going to add lots of good flavor. One thing to keep in mind is that all of these ingredients are at room temperature, which helps everything blend really well. For example, if I added cold eggs to this butter right now, the butter could clump up, and that's not what we want. Now I'm at the last step of the cake, which is to add the flour, the dry ingredients mixture, and the milk. So this is the point at which a lot of the cake recipes will say, alternate adding flour and milk into the batter, starting and ending with flour. And this recipe says add all the flour, beat it together, and then add the milk. Some people will tell you to alternate 3 times or 5 times. It all comes down to gluten, actually. So in this bowl right now, I have all of my butter, I have the sour cream, so there's all the fat in the bowl. But when I add my flour into the butter mixture, the idea is that the fat is gonna coat the flour proteins so that when I add the milk later, it's harder for the water in the milk to reach the flour to hydrate the gluten proteins and for gluten to form. So the more flour I add in this first addition right now, the more tender the cake is going to be because the less gluten is going to form. So even if your recipe says, add half the flour, all of the milk, and then all the rest of the flour, you can think about adding maybe 2/3 of the flour at first. The downside is that if I add all of the flour now and then all of the milk, I won't have any more flour to absorb any of the milk. So alternating back and forth helps kind of homogenize things a little bit. But for this recipe, since the recipe wrote it this way, I'm just going to add all the flour and then all of the milk and then mix it until it comes together. But I'm going to be very careful not to overmix once I have flour and liquid together. Alright, our batter's ready. You may have noticed as I was beating it that I kept on scraping it. This is just to make sure everything's evenly combined. It's especially important if you have like a stand mixer or something that's not going to get to the bottom or to the edges. Just make sure you physically move everything around in there to make sure it's all nicely combined. But now it's ready to bake, so I've just buttered and floured a couple cake pans. I'm gonna pour my batter in evenly, put them in the oven, and then we can talk about what's gonna happen in the oven. Alright, so now the cake is in the oven. Let's talk about what's happening. First, the butter, the fat is melting and the sugar is pulling more water towards it and dissolving in it to make kind of a syrup. And both of these processes are going to make the batter even thinner. Second, as the batter is becoming thinner, our leaveners, the baking soda and baking powder, are doing their thing. So in our cake batter, we have both baking soda and baking powder. The baking soda reacts with acidic ingredients in our cake, such as the yogurt, and that's going to create carbon dioxide gas. But the baking soda and yogurt by itself doesn't quite create quite enough air. So that's why the recipe also includes some baking powder to add even more carbon dioxide. So let's talk about making our cake tops nice and flat, because that's often preferred for decorating. So if we compare a cake, which we want to be nice and even, versus a muffin, which often looks nicer with like a nice peak on top, it comes down to oven temperature. So to get the peak in the muffins, what happens is the outsides are cooked before the insides. So the outsides can no longer rise, so they're shorter, but the insides are still rising, so they get higher and higher, and that's what gives us a nice dome. In a cake, however, we want them to set at about the same time so that the center can't rise anymore when the outsides are set. So we can bake cakes at a lower temperature, often 350 degrees, whereas muffins can be baked, anywhere from 375 to 400 degrees for that nice peak. All right, our cakes are done. So you can see they're a little pale on top and pretty flat and pretty level. And if your cakes are cooked, when you pull them out, they should not sink because the structure is solidified. The reason uncooked cakes sink when they come out of the oven is because the gases, as soon as they start cooling, they start contracting. And without the gas holding it up, the cake starts to sink. And that's also why it's important not to open the oven door too early in the baking process. As soon as we open the oven door, the cool air from outside is going to move in, and then gases are going to start contracting a little bit, and that's going to cause some uneven baking. I'm just going to let these cakes cool for a few more minutes in the pan, move them onto a cooling rack so that the air can circulate around it instead of causing water to condense on the inside. And then once it's cool, I'm actually going to wrap these in plastic wrap and then put them in the freezer. I like to split cakes up over a couple of days just because it's so much work and there's so much waiting for it to cool if I were to ice it today. So I'm just gonna freeze these, and next week I'm going to bring them back out, prepare the frosting, and ice them. That's it for today. Our cakes are ready, and stay tuned for part 2 where we're gonna talk about the mascarpone frosting, which is whipped cream based, and frost these guys.